every institution is saying, well, it has AI in it. And you're like, well, what the fuck does that mean? In the book, what we say is that it's less helpful to talk about AI and more helpful to talk about different forms of automation.
I think it's absolutely fascinating just how many different types of technologies aimed at just how many different types of automation get bundled and packaged into this one marketing term that then constitutes the con. AI is simply removing us further from the human on the other side of the screen, right?
When people are like, "Oh, sorry to share my humanity with you," people say it or like TMI or sorry to dump or like all of this stuff. Whereas like that's almost like shameful to be a human and to experience the emotional shit that we do. You don't have to be sorry. That's part of this arrangement. I'm also a human who has those messy, weird, painful feelings. So like, let's bond over it.
I'm feeling a little sassy today. I'm sorry.
Magnificent. Okay, we all ready?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Welcome to the Social iPod, where sociologists Winona,
When?
And Michelle.
talk with a variety of guests to expose complex relationships between the personal and the political.
Using sociology to explore big ideas.
And explore the taken for granted in everyday life. We break down the complexity of institutionalized issues and inequality through lived experience. And today we're joined by the Director of Research at the Distributed AI Research Institute, or DAIR, Dr. Alex Hanna. So welcome to our sociology podcast.
Yay, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Alex is a sociologist by training, and her work centers on the data used in new computational technologies, the ways in which these data exacerbate racial, gender, and class inequality. She also works in the area of social movements, focusing on the dynamics of anti-racist campus protest in the US and Canada. She holds a BS in computer science and mathematics, a BA in sociology from Purdue University, an MS and a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And along with Emily M. Bender, Alex hosts a podcast, Mystery Hype Theater 3000, and co-authored the book, The AI Con, exploring the hype behind AI and what we can do about it. From the start of this podcast, I have wanted you on as a guest to talk about AI.
Thanks.
Like, you were one
Appreciate
of the
it.
one of the first people I was like pitching, like, I know Alex, let's get them on.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you point out that AI is actually referring to automation in decision making, classification, recommendation, transcription, and then text and image generation in your book. And the AI itself is actually a marketing term. For our general audience, can you give us yours and Emily's take on what is AI?
Yeah, for sure. No, thank you for having me on. I mean, AI gets used to color a lot of different technology. I mean, it's a marketing term, and it's not even really, it's only recently, recently in terms of the last 10 to 15 years, that it's even been the marketing term of choice. And so everything has kind of been colonized into this term AI. And so you see lots of different ways in which companies and universities and nonprofit, every institution is saying, well, it has AI in it. And you're like, well, what the fuck does that mean? And so in the book, what we say is that AI, it's not less helpful to talk about AI and more helpful to talk about different forms of automation, what you mentioned when these different types of things. So decision making, automated decision making systems, that's taking something in social services or in government or in hiring or in loan applications and making a a pretty discrete decision, yes or no. Classification, it's determining whether something fits in this category or that category. A recommendation system, something like scrolling on TikTok, it is choosing what to show you next, or choosing what ad to serve you, or going on Amazon or an e-commerce site and having different recommendations. And then types of sequence to sequence translation, so machine translation or automated speech recognition. And then we have this thing called generative AI, which is this synthetic text or synthetic media generation. And it's not to say that methods under the hood may not be, may be similar or not, but that's not very helpful. If I'm at the end of the day, if there's like a neural network that is still behind some kind of classification algorithm, it is still it doesn't matter because the automation task is different. So like a good example as sociologists, we use logistic regression all the time, right? And logistic regression says, or linear regression, but like logistic regression is a pretty basic classification type algorithm. And so logistic regression, the typical way that sociologists use it is mostly because they're interested in the covariates. They're interested in why something, falls into one category or another. But what machine learning does is that it takes those covariates and it says, if you give this piece of data as input or this line of data as input, which class does it fall into? Now, the way that generative AI models work, specifically large language models, is that they are doing, the model is much larger than logistic regression, but it is doing next word prediction over and over and over again. So it's like your autocomplete, but doing that based on an existing collection of documents or training data. And then it is predicting the next word based on that. And that's a very reduced example. So everything is getting called AI because of different reasons. One of the reasons being that this type of synthetic or chatbot type interactive behavior has a history in the 1950s, and that became a term that people wanted to use because that was like it seemed interesting, and then it also gave this power of intelligence over these types of systems, for better or for worse, and in my opinion, very much worse.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating just how many different types of technologies and just how many different types of automation get bundled and packaged into this one marketing term that then constitutes the con, right? And so, this is present in your answer a little bit. I'm wondering if you'd be interested in expanding a little bit on the larger political economic conjuncture that we find ourselves in with AI, right? With quote unquote AI. Essentially, why now? Given that there is this long history that's been building and building and building, why is it all of a sudden that we are seeing, the little sparkly emoji with the AI applications in every app? And why it feels like increasingly I don't even have the option to consent to these technologies. What's happening in terms of the economy and the powerful actors in it, right? What's motivating the hype?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, generative AI, we have this very bizarre juncture of what happened in the world economy. I mean, so ChatGPT is released November 29th, 2022. So we're recovering from kind of a post-COVID or at least the post-lockdown economic slump. Um, there's been the sort of slashing of interest rates to try to prevent a recession by the U.S. Federal Reserve. There's then a dramatic rise in those interest rates to try to prevent this kind of massive inflation um, that is on the rebound. And then you have in those cases, because of this economic condition, a a kind of sense in which real production and real kind of industrial growth is slowing due to that. You have at the same time a situation in the tech industry in which the kind of revenues being generated are at a decline. Everybody's trying to find the next big thing. It was in the 2000s. It was the kind of Google Facebook ad duopoly. After that, in the 19 to 2010s, it is this rise of cloud infrastructure and moving a lot of different companies to the cloud. And so it's all the same players all over. It's Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Meta. Those are the big four. And then and so Amazon by far the top in cloud infrastructure, followed by Microsoft, then Google, then I think actually Meta wasn't really in that conversation. Number 4 was Oracle, kind of a far fourth. And so then trying to identify, so they start hitting a plateau in terms of trying to get people to move their workloads onto cloud infrastructure. And then it's like, what's the next big thing? And, Meta is like, we're going to stake the farm on the metaverse. That was stupid. And then, there's a few different other things. I mean, you got weird other entrants in the crypto and the blockchain and NFT space. So it's kind of right on time when ChatGPT comes out, because you've got this technology that is a few years old by that point. So 2017, Google publishes a paper called, which describes the original transformer model, which is the statistical model architecture that underlies large language models. And so they're already building these models, but then with this pretty low entry chat interface, it takes off, becomes, this fastest growing consumer product of all time, 100 million users, however they count an active user, and then we're off to the races. Everybody is trying to play catch up and trying to find a way to monetize it. And so then it just becomes this kind of thing where the valuations that we're seeing around the technology are just absolutely bonkers, and the real thing on offer here is if you replace whole, kind of whole swaths of labor, then this is the real deal. Like, you're going to be able to save so much fucking money. And I'm feeling a little sassy today. I'm sorry. But you're going to be able to save boatloads of money. You've made swaths of labor redundant, and so this is the real deal. And then you could also replace things like public sector workers or workers who are doing service and care work. And this is, and I'm gonna. You have another question around education, so I'm gonna wait around to speak to that. But then you have all these different elements that a lot of different actors want to get into, and so this buttresses funders of this from either private funders. It's buttressing public funders, people who are trading on the stock market. It is buttressing, and you're seeing this huge influx of venture capital, and so that's why you have these both new entrants into the market to develop AI tools near where I live in the Bay Area. You've got signs all over the place that advertise, they advertise AI tools and with the silliest names ever, and then and they're really marketed to 10 people, honestly, and then you have everybody trying to shove an AI thing into their product because they also want to increase their own valuations for their own companies. They're like, well, we have AI now, even though there's not really an application for it, or even if their company, their consumers, their customers don't want it.
I want to interject because my understanding too is that there's been a lot of political advocacy to deregulate AI, and that was one of Trump's first moves.
Yeah.
When he got elected the second time around, one of his first executive orders included deregulating and letting AI be sort of wild, wild west free for all, right?
Yeah, I mean, what he ended up doing is that he didn't really deregulate it per se because there wasn't really too much regulation. There wasn't too much regulation that existed. I mean, what he had done when he came into office is that Biden had a lot of different executive orders around AI, and they were still executive orders, so they didn't have too much power. But he did have a few different policy kind of frameworks out there. One of them was the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that says, well, I don't know if we claim Alondra Nelson. I think we should. But Alondra Nelson, when she was the second in charge at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, put a lot of work into, and it had a pretty broad scientific, both in social science and in computer science, and in some community consults into that piece or that framework. So that was scrapped. There was also a scrapping of I think there was a subsequent Biden executive order on that. And then what Trump did is that he defanged some of the regulatory agencies that were taking more aggressive enforcement actions around AI. And so at the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, Lena Khan was out. Lena Khan, I think maybe one of the youngest heads of the Federal Trade Commission, had written some pretty critical pieces on how to rein Amazon in. So had done some work on antitrust. The FTC was also working on some enforcement actions around certain pieces of their AI privacy harms or false advertising, and doing things that were oriented around consumer protection. His administration also hamstrung the FCC, the CFPB, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the Equal Opportunity Commission, and then the National Labor Relations Board, all of which were organizations that had pieces of trying to do enforcement actions on AI because there is no federal legislation on AI. What he did publish a year or two ago on his own executive order is the AI Action Plan. The AI Action Plan is basically says full steam ahead, basically no guardrails. Any regulation on this stifles innovation, build data centers, we got to compete with China, all this. And so there's basically no, it's not quite deregulating in the sort of repealing of any existing legislation. It's more like defraying the existing regulatory bodies that were taking any kind of enforcement action. The other thing that's been in the air and it's on the table, and I think it's back on the table again, is this idea of federal preemption of state AI regulation. They were trying to put in, I think, the National Defense Reauthorization Bill. They had some executive order on it, but you actually would need federal legislation to get to state level and local level preemption. But there's actually enough people in the Republican caucus that don't want that because of a lot of different issues, including data centers.
I feel like I may be, of the four of us, the least knowledgeable with AI specifically. So I'm at the wonderful position of just learning, taking all the info in, and this is what's happening in my mind. And so as I was reading a video, it was a talk that you and your co-author, Emily M. Bender, you were talking about all of this in your book. And one of the things that I put into my notes was that labor replacement is kind of the problem, right, quote unquote, that AI is promising to save, right, to figure out, to answer. But this is only really a problem for the wage payers, right? Because as you said earlier, they're really excited about AI because then it can save them a lot of money. But then something that popped into my head as I was listening to you all on that video was this huge contradiction that I see of the people who stand to lose the most are the people who are already so marginalized. And then something I see as I'm actively on the job market, but I know other people who are, also workers, and I know personally a few people who are working in like the AI training industry that is
Mm-hmm.
now a thing, and
Mm-hmm.
they're doing it because it's offering them a decent amount of money, being able to work from home. So there's like this extreme benefit for them as the worker. But then the contradiction then, right, is that they're really training kind of potentially their replacements.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or any
Mm-hmm.
insights right before we get
Mm-hmm.
into that education question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of wild that so much of the work that folks are seeing these days is that AI training. And I mean, that's been a kind of a sanitized term for what's been called data labor or crowd work or data annotation work or in a book by Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri called ghost work because it tends to be less seen or less visible. And this work has been around for, a good 2 decades at least. And, my second book is going to be around one of the first projects that relied on a huge amount of this data work called ImageNet, which is an important data set in the history of AI. And this data work is typically done by, I mean, folks who are either new, I mean, in the West, typically new job market entrants or people who have lost their jobs and are often looking for other types of skilled work to do. In a lot of different guises, it has been the work of people in the majority world, so people in Kenya or Venezuela, um, and some of my colleagues at DAIR, including sociologists Milagros Miceli, have developed the Data Worker Inquiry Project, in which data workers tell stories about their own work themselves, and then they publish reports or different types of outputs based on their experience. And this is stuff that we've heard around like content moderation. People doing kind of looking at the most awful things, looking at gore and violence and CSAM, which is child sexual abuse material and pornography, and then filtering it out, or they are sometimes impersonating intimate partners in some cases. And then, yeah, and then so we're seeing this kind of rise of expert data work as well. So if you were a lawyer and or something of that nature, you are, or you were or are a doctor, you are now doing that work if you were laid off in some other way. And so it might pay well now, but then what happens when, that work dries up or they feel like they are doing or the model performs well enough. And it's not to say that this work is gonna like ever completely go away, but it might be good enough in a certain, that there's good enough synthetic text generated for your, domain or your profession that the company decides that it is, they don't need any more data on it. Yeah. So that's yeah, kind of a weird, like one of these weird new job categories that has emerged, even though it's a little bit. I mean, it's been around for a while, especially in the majority world.
As you're talking, keep on remembering that I was a program assistant for the Scientific Resource Center, which managed the bids for systematic reviews from various research groups. And we're talking projects that were usually like two years long, and there would be like a specific research question, and these systematic reviews would always then be used to inform policy at the
Mm-hmm.
like federal level. And it would be, I think there was one around fentanyl, one around, stuff around like suicide prevention and guns, like whatever major social issues were happening. While I worked there, I didn't know this was AI at the time, but like in 2019, there was a librarian who part of her job was training a large language model. Because part of those systematic reviews, and also we had these other rapid reviews where we did data abstraction. So you are using, God, I cannot remember the program, but there's a program that pulls from PubMed and I think one or two other public journal repositories. And, you put in your keywords, it gives you all of the abstracts. And then usually you had research assistants reading the abstracts, determining, does this actually fit into these qualities of what is good research according to PCORI, these like research standards that rank the quality of research. And eventually, you would pull that data into a review. And so it's just like interesting that like already librarians are, their jobs have been sort of whittled away
Yeah.
but it's just like it's fascinating that at what are jobs that require higher education
Yeah.
are also being targeted.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that I think are seeing a shift from, I think, certain prior eras of automation. I mean, things that are considered to be more knowledge oriented or more back office or more people facing are now being considered to be fair game for labor displacement. And again, it doesn't matter if these technologies can do this well or not. It is good enough for a manager or a supervisor to suggest that it is. Um, in some ways and in some places, sometimes you don't even need the supervisor. Sometimes it is kind of initiated by people themselves. And it's actually quite interesting in which there's a little bit of a self-disciplining happening in some different places, in some different professions. I was talking about this with a friend of mine who's another scholar. I don't know where they're formally trained, but we've been wanting to write something about self-discipline and like Foucault and the ways in which people are doing their own self-disciplining with these tools, or they're suggesting, well, this is sort of good enough for me, and I'm going to use them, and I'm going to be so much more productive on this. And it's quite interesting too, because there's actually some research from management scholars that suggests that if you're using something like this, it can lead to more burnout. It can lead to more sloppy outputs because people feel like they can produce all the time. And it really gives me pause, and it asks, well, what are these outputs for? Is it actually for anyone? Is anyone reading this? Um, is anyone actually considering this? And if they are, why are you subjecting these people to this without actually considering what it is or what it does, or if it's functional or if it's helpful? And so it's moving at a speed at which it is not either socially desirable or really measured and considerate of what the outputs are. And I think that's, like we're seeing that in education a bit. And if we would, I don't know if we can move on to that, or because I got a lot to say about education,
Yes,
but
please.
I want to.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Yes, let me ask you the question so we can get into it.
Okay.
Yeah, so back to also just something that you've said within our conversation already, that you're making just things like make so much sense to me. But so we're going to talk about education specifically, but really we see that AI feels very inescapable right now, even though it's not, because that's a question I wrote down as I was watching your video. And then I was like, no, it is escapable, right? We can totally escape it as individuals, culturally, like if we were to do so, but it feels like it is. And I personally experienced this again on being on the job market. I see in so many of the descriptions for different positions, like you have to use AI, like specifically, like that is part of the job. And so every time I see that, I'm like, okay, on to the next posting. Like what? But then also, so that's disheartening, but more disheartening is all of the emails that I see in my like academic inbox that are right using AI for different reasons, and just like full condoning of it by not only the institution I'm at right now, but it seems like generally in the academic realm. And so our question is, like, we've heard pro AI folks in education settings argue that students need to learn AI because it's going to be in the workplace, and that AI can be a tool to make education more accessible. Can you describe the hype embedded in these arguments? What should sociologists and educators in general do in response?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely heard the argument students need to use this effectively to know how to do this. And students also feel pressure to do this as well, because you're taking a lot, either because you're hearing that employers want to use it or that everybody else is using it. And so if you don't use it, you're gonna be left behind, right? There's a few pieces of it. And one thing I want to mention is that there's a fantastic essay, and I keep on telling people about it as much as possible. It's a piece by Dan Green in the AAUP magazine Academe, and in it he outlines basically 6 reasons why we see it in the academy. And the name of the article is "What Does AI Do?" And Dan's argument, which I think is spot on, and I've said in different ways myself, and then he kind of summed it up in so many good ways, is we're effectively at a place where in the real economy, we don't have the level of productivity in kind of computing or knowledge work, or especially in the relational work that we have had in manufacturing or the production of widgets, where those can really, be traded. You've got neoliberal globalization that is led such that you've got these flows that make real, like make physical goods very, very cheap and accessible, or online services in some different ways. And so you are now leading to this place where there are these professions that don't have this kind of fungibility. I don't know if this is actually, I'm using that word correctly, but you don't have the same kind of fungibility. And so that as productivity increases in its different places, you can't really make services like teaching, like research, like nursing, like doctoring. You can't make those cheaper. And so Dan references this economist, William Baltmall, who identified this as what he calls cost disease. So basically, those things that are going to get more expensive over time, even if they're at the same price, because of the lowering cost of those other types of goods, and also because you have to pay those people more and more, basically. And so LLMs are effectively one of the kinds of potential solutions for that type of cost disease. And this is really attractive to the university. At the university says, there's teaching and research. Teaching and research are those things that don't scale. We tried MOOCs. We're trying, we try our executive schools, we've moved towards adjunctification and modularization. We have done so much of this other stuff. Now we're getting into a place where you as instructors gotta use this, and if you don't, this is going to be a problem. And so then there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of different organizations. I still get the Chronicle of Higher Ed, email, all of them around AI. Every single one's around AI, right? They're like, how to use AI, preparing your students for AI. It's all kinds of bullshit. And, part of that's because they're trying to attract a certain kind of, reader or investor. They're also trying to attract a lot of university administrators who find this to be very attractive. And so that's one element of it. Another element that Dan identifies is the credentialing feature of it, where students are trying to get their credential pretty much as soon as possible, right? They need a credential from an elite institution. And so you have this case where this credential is, is in the place where, as academics, we will criticize the type of lower ed, the type of stuff that Jesse McMillan Cotton has written on, those types of for-profit universities where you're just trying to get a credential. It's not accredited. It doesn't have kind of the force, they're very predatory. But this is like getting us to a place where this is rushing and pushing everyone down towards a type of lower ed type of privatized higher education credential. And then there's a few different other things. There's legitimacy, there's surveillance. The more and more we are, they're seeing more surveillance in the classroom that started with our learning management systems, and has just been absolutely going gangbusters now with LLMs. And then there is the back office usages, trying to do more with less staff, which has already been a major problem. If you've been in any kind of university lately, the staff cuts have been wild. And then lastly, just the investment. I mean, universities are basically banks that teach sometimes. And so if you're sitting on however million or $1 billion, I mean, this mostly goes for the most elite universities. But if you're sitting on all this kind of a huge endowment with your foundation, the stocks that are doing the stocks are doing the best on the public market, and then the private organizations that are promising the most return are AI. They're just AI, right? Or they're in tech. There's 8 companies. There's the magnificent 7 companies which are all in AI. So that's, what is that? Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle, Tesla, and Nvidia. And then you've got your big AI firms that are private: OpenAI, Anthropic, CoreWeave. I think there's probably like one more. And so then these are the organizations that are promising huge returns either on the open market or when they IPO. And so then it would be a contradiction of an organization's fiduciary duty not to invest in those companies. And so that's the kind of arrangement you've got in academia. And so then you've got on the other side the hype that is then oriented. Hello, a child just walked on the screen for our audio listeners. Hello, how are you? How's it going? So then you've got this other element of it where there is this desire to use AI on the job, and it's not really born out of this kind of, there's some of it that comes from a desire and a suggestion that it's going to say make people more productive. But I mean, it's more oriented towards, this is something that we maybe don't know how to use, but it's going to be huge for us. I mean, that's one driver of it. Employers think that some of the new entrants or new people that know how to use these tools are going to use them to mad success within their institution. So that's why they want to hire. And there's kind of this idea that Gen Z has the most literacy, which is not untrue. Gen Z does use these tools sort of begrudgingly. And then there's also this element of it. We want you to do more with less. If you're required to use AI in the job, it's gonna produce this type of job where you're going to be, you're somehow going to be 10x more productive. So I do think that's a lot of what's coming out of it. It's both the supply side and what the university is doing, and it's also the employer side of what they want out of you as an employee.
That's fascinating, and I think a great segue to our question, because you'll talk about how framing these technologies as cloud computing and the remoteness of material systems as ways we outsource current human suffering onto others, right? This has been present in our discussion a little bit, and I'm hoping that you can expand upon this and explain what is the impact of the types of technologies, all again under this AI umbrella, on both people and our environments, right?
Yeah, so I'll start with the environment and then also talking about the ways in which it is affecting people within those environments. And then there's a separate thing on people. So cloud computing, is this metaphor that's been around for a while. I don't know exactly when it started, but it's this idea that the compute that you use happens somewhere else. And so the best way of explaining it is it's someone else's computer that you kind of rent time on. And so to that degree, you have this kind of rentier relationship of certain types of cloud providers. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Amazon by far the biggest, followed by Microsoft, then Google, then Oracle. And so, cloud computing, as I said before, the current generative AI craze, mostly oriented around people's existing what they call workloads. I used to work in Google's cloud division, and those would do things like, serving websites or e-commerce or, hosting services, etc. And so now you've got this move in which you've shifted to both training loads and inference loads. And so training loads are actually creating the very big models. So something like ChatGPT has behind it a model, and currently I think it's GPT 5 or 5.5, and then there's dozens, if not hundreds, of different versions of that model that they are effectively continuously training. They are continuing to produce this because they're always trying to look for these marginal improvements. They're making licensing deals with journalism outfits. They're finding new data here. They're doing translation. They're producing synthetic data. And so they are continually retraining these models. That training has to occur on specialized hardware, which is called a graphic processing unit or a GPU. And those are produced by, in the US, one company produces the hardware, and they contract to basically one or two companies to produce the actual chip. In this case, it's Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, or TSMC. So NVIDIA had been sort of a middling organization, had produced graphics cards for like serious gamers. The things that these processing units can do very well is that they can multiply big matrices together effectively. They can do linear algebra at scale. And so this is a major operation in training large language models and the type of multimodal models that we see with these really large data sets. These GPUs are very energy intensive. They require just massive amounts of energy to do both training and also to serve the different models. And serving is in hosting them. That's the inference part. So when you type in whatever into ChatGPT, it takes this model, it takes your prompt, it then, does the kind of prediction of what word is next, and then it delivers it back on the interface. And so to scale it up to all these different users, to train these all models, it takes a lot of energy to do so. And so then that's where you get into the physicality of these different data centers. These data centers are getting larger and larger in the kind of, we're getting to this idea of the hyperscale data center, the data center that either, consumes a very large amount of energy, has this huge both physical and ecological footprint. We've seen data centers near you, Winona, in Salt Lake City, that Kevin O'Leary, the Shark Tank guy, wants to put there. And there's been huge local opposition there. We're seeing this in all over the country. I mean, we've seen it in Maricopa County in Arizona. We've seen it in an intensification in Data Center Alley in Northern Virginia. in Georgia, and probably one of the most notorious cases due to a huge amount of community resistance in Memphis, where XAI, owned by Elon Musk, built a data center called Colossus that was running, I think, to start on 35 gas turbines that were not registered with Shelby County. And so then the other part of that is that data center is located in a historically black area known as Boxtown, and an area that's already been historically disinvested in and is leading to more environmental racism. So when it comes to these data centers, they are they impact people living in the area in a few different ways. The first that I think people start to be attentive to was carbon output, and so the training and the inference of models is very carbon intensive, just required just based on the energy that is needed to do both of those operations, as well as the embodied carbon in the production of the hardware. They're also very water intensive, water via cooling. And so there's been certain cases. So I believe in, there's been a lot of concerns there, especially in Utah, in that project, in the Salt Lake City project, the different projects in Georgia, as well as what happens with the water after. There was this video of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez showing the kind of output of the cooling operations. Sound is a major concern, just the amount of kind of ambient sound that is in which residents in local communities, and then energy usage and who is paying for that increased energy usage. So that's typically going to ratepayers, and then the small air particulates produced by data centers, specifically in some place like Boxtown. If you have something that is fully gas burning, that's going to produce an intense amount of air pollution. But then these data centers also require diesel engines for backups. Data centers have to fulfill something like a 99.999% SLA, which is called the service level agreement, which means they have to be up they can only have 5 minutes of downtime in a year. And I want to give a shout out to Ashika Allgood, who I did a panel on, and has her, and she has for that statistic. And so that means that you always have to have backups at the ready. They do tests on that backups. There's already evidence and estimates from a researcher, Shaolin Ray at UC Irvine, that the impact of data centers, and especially their small air particulates, are already producing excess deaths over and above what is expected for particular regions, and that is falling on areas that already where people already have the highest public health burden. So the poorest areas, so London County, Virginia, Southern California. It's like San Bernardino County that is already doing really badly because of the major port traffic there, like a lot of it through Amazon and UPS, and then places like central or the foothills of Appalachia in Ohio, where central Ohio is actually a place where there's a lot of data center development. My mom lives in rural Ohio on the other side, and there's actually a lot of data center opposition from actually really conservative areas. And it's typically, not on the kind of climate change carbon element of it, but it is because ratepayers are going to pay more, and because the water table is having impacts on the water table. So there's these huge impacts that are then really drawing on existing patterns of environmental racism and exacerbating public health concerns by Black and Brown communities and low-income people.
Thank you for that, Alex. I really appreciate you bringing up, for example, Kevin O'Leary's proposed mega data center project here in Utah. I think it's also been very interesting. It's been massively unpopular, right? And obviously it's gotten a lot of attention, both here but also nationwide. And similar to what you described as far as what's happening in rural Ohio, right? We have seen, interestingly, in terms of social movements, this sort of spontaneous forging of unity between a lot of like actors and interests from urban Salt Lake City and sort of the greater developed area and rural Utah, right? Which often are kind of pitted at odds against each other by the powers that be here, we'll say. And so, if when we're thinking in terms of people's professed political ideologies, this has been very much a unifying issue. And if we're looking at class, maybe the difference is quite clear. Anyways, I'm sure I could ramble about that for a while, but important to keep those impacts and their potential implications for movements and what can actually be done about this issue, I think, top of mind. I'm looking at the time. Is there anything that you would want to speak to, Alex? Anyone's work you'd like to shout out? Wynn, Michelle, anything else you'd like to bring up before we conclude?
I would give a shout out. I would just say like AI is not inevitable. I mean, I think there's different ways we can push back. One thing that I had the opportunity to advise a little bit on was something called the AI Resist List. So AI, which is at airesistlist.org. That was kind of a joint thing with journalist Karen Howe, the author of Empire of AI, Petra Molnar, who's at the Refugee Law Lab, Tania Duarte, and then through my employer, DAIR, and then the We in AI, and also Petra's org. Also want to give a shout out to a project I've done a lot of work on, and we released this week, which is called 2 weeks ago, called the Luddite Lab, and which is specifically a resource that we released called the Luddite Lab Resource Hub, which you can find at labor.dair-institute.org. Yeah, but otherwise, I mean, I think this is a sociology podcast. I will say that there is a lot of space for sociologists to do important work on tech. This is something I've been saying for 20 years. Sociology is actually quite well situated to study tech. And not just the technology itself, but also the social arrangements around tech.
I appreciate that. Links to those resources will be in the description.
I also just love, I know, I don't know how widespread it is, but I know, in the last couple years, there's also been more interest in, mesh network and sort of, alternative ways to communicate outside of this conglomerates of technology. So it's I agree with you, Alex. There's so much. It's very interesting. And also I think the arguing that people who are against AI are Luddites or, not, it's that is right. It's meant to shame people. I didn't in your book, isn't Luddites, you talk about the Luddites as they were actually pro-technology, but they were against getting rid of jobs, and so they actually went and sabotaged. It's just so fascinating to learn those things and reframe how we think about resistance to dehumanization through capitalization.
100%.
Luddites did nothing wrong.
Luddites did nothing wrong. I have a Luddite hat that that was sent by some friends at the Library Freedom Project.
That's awesome.
Well, cool.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We will plug, I want to just plug one more time, your book, The AI Con, your podcast, Mystery AI Hype 3000, and the Distributed AI Research Institute. We will link all of those. I've been reading your book and listening to your podcast, and both are really fascinating for sociologists, and I think also your podcast and the book are really accessible. So,
Great.
Yeah.
Glad to hear that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your knowledge and your work.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Alex. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
That was so great.
I know I want to talk longer. I want
I
more.
know. I think we could. I have a couple of thoughts that I was like, I will save these for after. As Alex was talking, I kept on thinking about organic and mechanical solidarity. And I'm like, we have moved into a new kind of solidarity where there is no solidarity or something like that. Yeah, that was just like a thought that I had, that like our social conditions, like we're more splintered and we're not as connected, and like again, people are like fighting, people are buying into AI and getting rid of their own jobs, like training the AI and talking about it as inevitable. And like, I feel like that, like, there's got to be a part of how we feel about each other that is wrapped into that, right? Like,
I think it's a very important question of alienation, right? Which, if I, in hindsight, would write another question, it would concern like that very human element of, because similar to so many other forms of automation, I think that AI is simply removing us further from the human on the other side of the screen, right? The human that wrote the material, that chained the chatbot, and within, right? Because of, again, talking about just how fundamentally we are social creatures and developed through socialization, right? That's still happening, but it's even more mediated in even more sinister ways. That is a function of automation in the interest of capital, blah, 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 right?
Yeah, something I was just going to say, this is like, it might be like a few threads away, but something I keep thinking of is like, as we're talking about this, like alienation and dehumanization, a question that we have like how earlier about how we displace the mental and emotional work and outsource, it was Winona's question, outsourcing the current human suffering onto others. Something that is like, I think culturally tied together and related to this underpinning bit is like when people are like, oh, sorry to share my humanity with you, whether like, how different people say it, or like TMI, or sorry to dump, or, like all of this stuff. Whereas like we can think about it interpersonally, like they're consenting relationships and shit like that we're talking about, like, okay, there, I understand to certain degrees, but I think a lot of it is like every time I'm coming into interaction, even with people I know well, there is this like, it's almost like shameful to be a human and to experience the emotional shit that we do, because we're like, oh, I'm sorry to unload on you about this or whatever. It's like, you don't have to be sorry. That's part of this arrangement, the social arrangement. And like, I'm also a human who has those messy, weird, painful feelings. So like, let's bond over it. Let's commiserate. Let's share that together and connect our humanities, rather than being like, no, let's sterilize ourselves mentally and emotionally. And then because of that, we're so prepped to go to AI, to like be talking to, I don't know, like, I don't even know what they are. There was this one, and now this is a bit of a tangent, but it's related. There was this one young person working at the checkout in this one grocery store that we went to, but he was constantly talking to like his meta glasses or whatever the fuck they are, and was like, hey Google this, and asking, like having just like full on conversation with his glasses, but also being around like a bunch of people. It was so strange. Anyway.
It's so fucking sad. I think, oh god, I had a thought. Oh yeah, it's just like, how dare you burden me with a feeling and why you're feeling it. That's trauma dumping, right? Or another like cultural example lately has been the protect your peace discourse, on social media, which is very sinister in that it's like, I think it's a really clear illustration of neoliberal subjectivity, right? Or in other words, how we are socialized by broader cultural forces to, behave as good little consumers in capitalism, right? And that is by treating each other as products, right? To consume, to engage with according to a market logic, right? And like, AI is obviously not the first example of this. Like, at this point in my life, I'd rather be single than use a dating app because of the way it reinforces that behavior. But it didn't, in the way that dating apps seek to privatize what used to be a public social thing, which is taking like us meeting people through life and falling in love with them and being instead, we're going to give you a shittier version of that is designed in a way to always make you keep coming back, right? For a new product, a new high, in the form of the branded version of another human being that's fine-tailored to optimize an algorithm to help you fuck, right?
Underlying tenets here too are like of white supremacy or perfectionism and the right to comfort and all of those things, right? That are just like undergirding this whole shit.
Yeah. I think also like rooted in like again, this is like all rooted in our political economy and the gendering and like just the way that capitalism is gendered, heterosexualized, racialized, like the racial capitalism piece of it. I just think about the ways in which a lack of emotion is tied to the idea of productivity. Like if you're not emotional, then you can be more productive is the idea, right? And so AI has no emotion, no empathy, is not going to waffle on hiring decisions. If you're getting a score and that score is deciding who gets an interview, if you just happen to write maybe you don't write something well or it doesn't score well, right? Then you're like not going to be considered. And there's no empathy there for the person who's behind it. And like we've sanitized all of these processes and like done it kind of slowly too, where it's like some of the stuff where we're seeing like the generative AI, again, it's like, oh yeah, this stuff has been building, as Alex said, for 20 years. And we didn't realize what was actually happening or that we were part of that training. And, you know, I think that a lot of people would have probably acted differently if we knew or realized where it was heading. But I just feel like there's so much of our political economy and social conditions and the neoliberal condition that we're in that is affecting where we're at right now and is part of that dehumanization. And that like ties into the dehumanization in those totally intimate interpersonal experiences. And yeah, it takes so long to like, that's something I'm actively working on with my current partner, is like both of us trying to be less apologetic for having feelings and reactions and like talking through those feelings rather than holding them in and being like, oh, I just got to deal with this on my own. Yeah, I think that there's like places for resistance, and I think like, yeah, our interpersonal relationships is one of those places we gotta try to resist that.
Oh, I mean that is what's accessible at the individual level, right? You know, you mentioned, you know, maybe folks would behave differently if we know, but really, you know this, we all know this. Like, I think really present in a lot of today's conversation is the lie of how much agency you have under neoliberal subjectivity as a consumer engaging in markets, right? Talks about the environmental impacts a lot, and the environmental movement has been very defanged by the shift from like a mass movement struggle orientation to, well, I'm just going to buy the plastic straw, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? I think that AI has really brought this contradiction to the forefront of where, like, no, this is actually serving as a catalyst for movement building, and that's what's bringing the goods, right? There has been both this spontaneous upswing and this building of organization against the data center here in Utah, right? And it's already exerting enough political leverage that the electeds here are backsliding. And we haven't won enough yet, but it is happening. And so I think something I find very optimistic about this conversation is that AI is now foregrounding these things at a collective level, and that wasn't there before. And so at the same time that we are learning better how to actively resist these things in our personal lives at that level, at that social scale, I find great hope in how we are also learning to resist at a higher scale.
Yeah, it's almost like when you said like we didn't know about them like 20 years ago. The last 20 years, it hasn't been as well known, and now it is. And it's like the hype has actually kind of told on themselves. They've told on themselves a little bit. Like now we know it's a thing.
Yeah.
And now we really know, and we really see all of this, the terrible harm that it's causing. So that was a nice balancing perspective.
Yeah. I wish we had had more time to talk about that with Alex too.
Yeah. Oh my God, there's so many more things I want to talk
I
about or related to
know.
this. Like it's sparking, I want to talk to someone about surveillance.
Gosh, yeah, we didn't even really get to that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, I think that ties into the social media piece too,
Totally.
because, or not social media, social movement piece
Yeah.
that you're just talking about of like our increase in surveillance and I feel like a decreased resistance to surveillance is part of what has contributed to the like also defanging of our social movements.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing it right now in different movement contexts. Well, that's probably a good place for us to conclude.
Yeah, I was going to say, I could go on forever, but we shouldn't. I do need to go walk some dogs, and I'm sure you both have plenty of things to do.
Oh, yes, but I'm very much enjoying being here.
Me too.
So we'll count it down with a thank you for listening.
I'm right.
You've been listening to the Social Eye podcast. Join us next time for another guest. This was a great conversation.
Thank you
Thank
for
you for
listening.